So welcome to the CSAW webinar series. We're very excited that you're here. And today we are talking about writing better requirements using the ARC method. All right, so this is going to be exciting. This is applicable for all, whether you are at a civilian agency or a DoD component. We are the Civilian Service Acquisition Workshop program, but the technique we're going to be talking about today is just darn applicable to writing better requirements, no matter where you're at. So we're very glad that you're here. Welcome, welcome. All right, so quick introduction. My name is Jonathan Evans. I am the program manager and senior facilitator for the Civilian Service Acquisition Workshops program. I'll be talking a little bit about my program at the end of the presentation today. I've been working in government in the federal acquisition workforce for 15 years. I started off as a contract specialist, and after a few years of that, I moved on to the program side of the house and have done a number of things on the program side of the house, some of which have involved writing requirements. But I've worked my way around lots of different things: fleet management, human capital, product development, agile, strategic planning, a little bit of everything. But everything always pointed me back towards acquisition. And as I started to get back into acquisition more on an education and policy side of the house, I began to specialize in performance-based acquisition. And we're going to talk about performance-based acquisition today because it is a critical component of what we're doing. So we'll talk about performance-based acquisition, we'll talk about facilitation, and obviously we're going to talk about writing better requirements. So that's what's up today. John dropped a copy of the slide deck into the chat. If you're not able to download it from the chat, no worries. We will get it sent out to everyone. But we've got a great group here. Over 300 of you here, so this is fantastic. Okay. So please make use of the Q&A pod to ask any questions. If you want me to see your question and try and respond to it over the course of our webinar today, please put it in the Q&A. If you have any comments or feedback or just general thoughts and interests, go ahead and use the chat. You can chat with us, the hosts and co-hosts. You can chat with each other. All of it is welcome today. All right, so let's get into it. Writing better requirements, the ARC method. So in order for me to talk about writing better requirements, first got to talk about performance-based acquisition. Marcel, yes, we will talk about SOWs a little bit. All right, so performance-based acquisition. Performance-based acquisition, the FAR says that performance-based acquisition is the preferred method for acquiring services. All right, so a lot of the focus you're going to hear me talking about today is really focused on services acquisition. So if you're doing more commodity buys and product buys, the content of today's webinar will still help you. You can still apply the concept, but I am going to be talking about it through a lens of services acquisition, because that is a critical area where we have a lot of struggles in terms of writing clear requirements. So what is performance-based acquisition? Performance-based acquisition, in a nutshell, means we are not telling vendors how to do the work. Just don't do it. Just don't tell industry how to do the work. We're going to find industry vendors, partners that will come on board and help us to achieve the work using their best practices, their innovations. They're going to achieve the work. So what we need to tell them is what we want to be achieved. We want to share with them, here are the results, the outcomes, the deliverables that we are looking for you to help us with. Okay, that's it. We tell them, here's the result, here's the outcome, here's the deliverable. You figure out how to get it done. That's performance-based. Now, in order to make an effective contract that can procure that effectively, we really need 4 key elements. So let's look at those 4 key elements. Number 1, we're going to move away from using a statement of work, because a statement of work, an SOW, is prescriptive. It's telling vendors how to do the work. It's telling them which labor categories to use, or it's telling them how many hours they need to assign to labor categories. It's prescriptive. All right, and we've been using statements of work for a long time. And even those of you out there who may have transitioned to using a performance work statement, you may still be prescriptive in your language. So we want to be mindful of that. We don't want to be prescriptive, and we also don't want to be ambiguous. So we're going to talk about both of those things. How can we be clear, precise, and concise with our language without being prescriptive and without being ambiguous? All right, so a performance work statement is structured around what we want to accomplish, the results, the outcomes, the deliverables. That is what a performance work statement is based around. We don't say how. Now, a statement of objectives is really just a higher level document that talks about our big, broad, audacious objectives that we have, because we don't really know what tasks might be involved, what deliverables might be there, what outcomes specifically we're looking for. All we can say is these big, giant objectives. And what happens is industry comes back to us with a performance work statement. So they write a performance work statement in response to a statement of work, and whoever is selected, we incorporate their performance work statement into the contract. Otherwise, the government is writing the performance work statement. And it's hard. Many of you, I am sure, on this call today are part of program office, or you're a core or otherwise responsible for writing requirements. And to be honest, in my years of growing up as a core and working in the program offices, I would not have understood how to write requirements, except that I had been a contract specialist first. If I had not had those years as a contract specialist going to FAC-C training and getting spun up in writing requirements and how contract types are structured and acquisition planning and all that, I wouldn't really understand everything that goes into it. Because we don't do a very good job in government of providing that sort of support to our program offices and our cores. All right, so this webinar today hopefully will help with some of that. So if you're using a performance work statement that is based on results and outcomes, then you also need to have measurable performance standards. All right, so measurable performance standards, we're talking about timeliness, we're talking about quality, we're talking about progress. Now, a lot of you, if you're using a performance work statement today, you might have a list of deliverables and when they're due. Some folks call it a deliverable matrix. There's lots of other terms for it. I want to shift the paradigm today. If you're doing that today, that's great, but I want to add to it. If you're not talking about quality with your performance standards, you're missing out on a ton. Because if you don't have a standard for quality, then you're missing out on what you're getting, right? So then you get into this disagreement with the vendor about, hey, we expected it to look one way. They said, where did you say that? He said, well, we didn't actually, but you should have known. No, it's our job as the government to be transparent about our expectations for quality as much as we are clear about when we want things delivered. All right, so whenever we write a requirement statement, it goes hand in hand with a performance standard, usually a couple of them, quality and timeliness. So requirement, quality, timeliness, requirement, quality, timeliness, every time. All requirements have standards. If you're not doing that today, that's the number one thing you can change to get a better set of results and outcomes on the back end. All right. So those are our first two things. One, we're using a performance work statement structured around results and outcomes. Two, we have performance standards for all requirements. Three, we choose appropriate incentives to drive higher performance and promote innovation. All right, so incentives are tricky. All right, incentives are a way of encouraging performance in a particular area, but we have to be mindful of how we use incentives. So do we have to have monetary incentives for all of our requirements? No. Do we have to use an incentive type contract? No. Well, then what's the answer? The answer is you have appropriate incentives. Okay, so incentives, and we're not going to dig into this too deep today, but when it comes to incentives, we can look at a combination of contract type, particular incentive type contracts, if that's appropriate, or just a standard contract with incentives for each individual requirement. And it doesn't have to be for every requirement. Maybe we want to incentivize particularly critical requirements that we have. Right. So you can have a complex incentive strategy, and it can be monetary, non-monetary. And if you want to learn more about that, we'll have a webinar in the future that talks about incentive strategies. But for today, just know that if you're doing a performance-based acquisition, you should consider an appropriate incentive strategy. What is my take on disincentives? Use them, okay? But if you're going to have disincentives, you need to be thinking about the carrot as well. You can't just come at industry with a stick and say, this, if you don't do this on time, it's disincentivized. If you don't do this on time, you're going to get a fee. If you don't do this, stick. You need to come in and also have that carrot that says, if you do well, if you exceed our expectations, here's what we can offer you. Otherwise, it's not that great, right? Because the baseline is you get paid for what you said you were going to do, or you get docked. There's no, you get paid for what you said you're going to do, but if you exceed that, there's an option for you to receive some incentives. So you have to have both sides of that incentive structure. All right. Quality assurance surveillance plan. So if you're going to have performance standards that you have to keep an eye on for all of the requirements that are focused on results and outcomes, then you need some way to monitor it. And the way we monitor it is using a quality assurance surveillance plan. And this is a living document that the government maintains. The quality assurance surveillance plan should not have new requirements. It should not contain new standards. The requirements and standards should all be captured in the requirements section of the contract. The quality assurance surveillance plan is only copying and pasting from the contract and adding our inspection methodology, our surveillance methodology, what we're going to look at, how frequently we're looking at it, who's doing the looking, and how we're calculating whether or not they're meeting their standards and AQLs. Okay, so the quality assurance surveillance plan should not be incorporated into the contract. It should not contain anything new, no new requirements, no new standards, none of that. All of that should be in your performance work statement. If you have all four of these elements, you probably have a performance-based acquisition. And still, all right, we can go a step further in trying to identify how to write better requirements. So let's keep going. We're going to talk about the ARC method. All right. Anonymous says, as far as incentives, what I was just saying, that is a best practice, but there isn't a reg that says you have to have that incentive balance correct. That is correct. There's no reg that says you have to balance your incentives. However, I can tell you from experience that when you come in with a stick only, a disincentive only strategy, you're creating a contentious relationship out the gate with your partner, with your industry partner. It's not even really a partnership. It's more of a, I'm in command, do what I tell you, or else I'm going to dock you. All right, that doesn't create a good partnership. So if you want the partnership, you need to have the balance. All right, ARC. This method, as far as I know, I'm crediting Defense Acquisition University for pioneering the ARC method, action result context. And based on my work with them and the research I've done, I believe that this method really kind of evolved in the mid or the early 2000s. So I know that they were instructing on the ARC method as early as 2009. It may have been earlier than that. But the bottom line is this methodology has been around for a while, and it's something that we teach in our workshops, which I'll talk about later. But that's why I wanted to do this webinar, because I wanted to take this technique and expand the audience. I want more of you to know about this technique because it makes things so much easier. All right, so it's three simple elements. Every requirement statement has these three elements. And the most important element is the middle one, the R, the result. Okay. So if you take a look at a requirements document, a statement of work or a performance work statement that you have today, and you look at those giant paragraphs with all their adjectives and nouns and all the mumbo jumbo in there, we'll talk about that. Reading through those, I want you to think about what are the specific outcomes, the specific results, the specific deliverables that I'm actually asking for. All right, clear, specific results, outcomes, and deliverables. And if you're reading through an existing document, just on a pen and paper or a separate document, just write out what are the results. Write those out. Okay, that's your first step, is to write out what are the results and outcomes. Specific things that you can look at and say, yes, there's the result. Yes, there's the deliverable. Yes, this is the outcome. So once you've got a list of those results, the next step is to apply the action. And when you're applying an action, you're talking about an action verb. So deliver, create, draft, provide. And it's really important that you choose the right action verb. So for example, if we are talking about training, and we'll see this on the next slide, if we're talking about training and I say the contractor shall provide training, there is an implication that the training already exists. They just have to provide it. Right? So if I also want them to develop the content for that training, the curriculum, then I need to have a requirement statement that says the contractor shall create training curriculum for some topic. And then the contractor shall deliver approved training to the, to whomever, right? To whoever the stakeholders are. And you're going to see why this is important in terms of being precise and concise and also factoring in performance standards, right? Now, when it comes to context, context is just putting the action and the result, you got it, in context to each other. Identifying stakeholders, identifying historical relevant information that could help vendor price out how they're going to propose against that requirement. It is literally context, and we're going to see some examples of this. So if we look at the action result context model, we look at this original statement. So every requirement statement, every single requirement statement begins with the contractor shall. Now, according to the FAR and FAR definitions, if you want to use the contractor must, you can do that as well. You either need to use shall or must, and you must, pun intended, use that word consistently. So don't interchange shall, must, shall, must. Pick shall or pick must and stick with it. Okay, that's super important. It'll add consistency and strength to how you're structuring your requirements. So first thing we need is our intro statement, the contractor shall. Okay, now the next thing, just in terms of the ARC, we can look at, okay, here's our action verb, train. All right, contractor shall train. Now we're going to look at why this might be ever so slightly problematic, and some of you might say I'm being overly picky here, but I'll explain myself later. But right now it does say train. Okay, so let's skip the result, right? We said the result was the most important part, but I'm going to make this most important part come last. When it comes to context, anything following a preposition is context. So one of the things that you want to look out for when you're reading through your document is, are you burying the lead? Are you taking your result and outcome and burying it in your context? Because as soon as you hit a preposition, you are talking about the relationship between the verb and the result. So if your real true result is buried in the context somewhere, you've buried it. And now it's not clear. Are we talking about this thing buried over here, or are we talking about the first thing that you said? So it's important that your context is not defining the result in terms of a clear, specific, objective result or outcome, but it's simply putting it in context. All right. So in this model, we have a preposition on, and you can see down at the bottom there's some examples of different preposition types. But we hit the word on, and that lets us know that everything following on is context, which leaves us with system end users. If we're using this model, then the result here following this model is system end users. And I don't think that's the result. The real result here is really training. All right, so what is the product? What is the outcome? What is the result we're looking for? That is training. Now, the effect of that training is that it is effective so that our system end users can effectively use the system. That's our performance standard, which is why requirements and standards always go together. But the actual deliverable is the training. All right, so if we rewrite this statement, oh, stand by. We got a little error thing here. Let me, we'll fix this up. Okay. We'll delete those. There we go. Okay. Revisions. The contractor shall deliver training to end users on how to use the system. Why is this important? Because we still have a clear action verb that talks about how we're getting the training. In this case, it's delivery. We're delivering the training. So again, the assumption is that that training already exists. Either we are asking them to deliver a commercial off-the-shelf training that they already have in-house, or we have the training curriculum that we want them to go and deliver, or there's another requirement somewhere in the requirement set that says the contractor shall create training curriculum on all aspects of the system. Now, in this case, I was working with a customer agency who was wanting to buy a commercial off-the-shelf system. Right, so the vendor already had the system and therefore already had training that they had developed for their system. Therefore, they simply wanted a requirement that said, hey, you'll deliver training that you already have to our users on how to use the system. Pretty straightforward. Okay. But as I talked with them about this original statement, one of the other things that came up is, oh, we also want them to create a user manual for all aspects of the system so that users can effectively train themselves. Got it. Well, either they're going to create a user manual because they don't have one, and that's going to be fleshed out in market research, or they're going to deliver or provide a user manual because they already have one associated with their system because we're buying a COTS product. So market research should help inform how you write these requirements as well. Which is why you should not do market research as a standalone activity. It should be intertwined with your requirements writing process, right? As you're writing requirements, go, hey, gosh, I don't know. Do they have existing user manuals? Do they have existing training for this COTS solution that we're looking for? I don't know. Let's go do some market research. Once we get the research back, that will help us to shape how we write our requirements. All right. So we can see that the revision here of this original statement, it's a nuanced tweak, and I'll show you some more drastic changes in a few slides here, but I want to point out some of the nuanced changes. We're focused on the result being training, the result being a user manual, and for training, we can measure the quality of that training. We can do that in a number of ways. We'll look at that later, but we can measure the efficacy, the effectiveness of that training and its impact to our users and the organization, how effective it was. The user manual, we can evaluate how well written it was. Did it cover all aspects of the system? Was it professionally developed? There's lots of things that we can evaluate from a quality standpoint of the user manual. And for both of these, we can now independently measure the delivery of these from a timeliness standpoint. Was the training delivered in a timely manner relative to our needs as an organization? Same with the user manual. Did we receive it at a certain point in time that would be effective for our users to actually have it? All right, so our performance standards then become critical because that's where we are communicating our expectations. Now, here's an alternative from another team that was also working on buying some software. In this case, they were buying software as a service. And you'll notice here, this says the contractor shall deliver on-demand training so users can independently develop and deploy surveys using software as a service. So why do I bring this example up? I bring this example up because here we've stated on demand. Now, earlier I said that a statement of work is prescriptive and a performance work statement should not be prescriptive, right? If we're doing performance-based acquisition, we should stay away from being prescriptive. Well, on demand is specifying that the training has to be on demand, which is in commercial terms, basically a user can go and access that training whenever they want, right? So it's some sort of web-based training that users can access whenever. When this requirement was written, we were in the middle of a pandemic. So if we were to say the contractor shall deliver training, then that could open up the door to the vendor coming in, proposing or executing in-person classroom-based training, which would not have flown because we were in a COVID posture. So in this case, it became appropriate for them to specify that they wanted on demand. Now, this was further amplified by the fact that this agency had done their market research and determined that of the vendors that could provide the software as a service they were looking for, they all had on-demand training. They had YouTube channels, or they had a page on their website that had this on-demand training. So it was really just a matter of saying, hey, we, the government, want that too. All right, and we're going to write the requirement for it so that we can ensure that we get it. All right, so that's important. And you can see here below this ARC statement, the contractor shall deliver on-demand training so users can independently develop and deploy surveys. That's our ARC statement. That's our requirement. Now there's an additional context. We want to add an additional statement to provide some useful information to industry so that they understand our requirement better. Notice it is in the form of a bullet. It is not part of a run-on paragraph. If you have big, giant paragraphs, it's too much. We want to have a clearly articulated requirement statement, and if we need it, additional context statements in the form of bullets. I'll show you some examples later of how to structure your requirements for effective reading and conveying the message that you're trying to convey. All right, so this additional bullet just talks about the types of users and that training will be needed for all functions of the system. All right, we could also add additional context here if we wanted, if it were applicable. And so we'll talk more about that with some future slides. Anonymous asks in the Q&A, would you say create and deliver / provide a user manual? In other words, why not take this requirement here, the contractor shall create a user manual, and say the contractor shall create and provide, or create and deliver? So in this case, the user manual itself is the deliverable. And so if they're going to create the deliverable, we don't have to say, you've created it, now give it to us. You're creating it for us. So what we are going to inspect, right, when we do our inspection, is the user manual, right? And our performance standards are going to talk about the quality of the user manual in terms of how it's drafted, its completeness, its accuracy. So we will have to have the user manual. So we don't need to ask them to deliver it as well. We just say create a user manual for all aspects of the system. The artifact that will be provided to us is the user manual because that's the result. Now, that is different from, for example, the training requirement here, because when we say the contractor shall create training curriculum on all aspects of the system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay, they're creating training curriculum. They're creating that. We don't want to say the contractor shall create and deliver training curriculum because we want an intermediate step. We want to be able to evaluate the training curriculum first. Is that training curriculum comprehensive? Does it cover all of the learning objectives that we've identified? And then if it does, and we're okay with that, then we might have a statement that says the contractor shall deliver approved training to end users on how to use all aspects of the system. Okay, so we create a dependency in there. Generally speaking, you should have only one action verb. I'll show you some examples later on in the slides where we might have more than one action verb in a statement, but generally, if you have an and, you might need two statements. If you have an or, you definitely have two statements. Okay, because you can't have a requirement that says do this or do this, because then they'll go, well, which one do you want? And if you're okay with them just doing one or the other, literally a trade-off, you can either create a user manual or deliver training. Okay, well, you're going to get one or the other, but that creates some problems from a pricing standpoint. So, Sarah, I hear you on the incentives, and duly noted. I think we're going to have a webinar on incentives, probably in our FY24 webinar lineup. So stand by for that. But if you want to talk about that offline, feel free to reach out. I'd be glad to talk with you. Okay, let's keep going and look at some additional examples here. So here's an example. This is a real example from a real agency. The original statement is part of their draft performance work statement. As you can see here, we have a typical paragraph that starts with the contractor shall, and then it just runs on. And actually, this is only an excerpt. I believe that this was probably 2 or 3 times longer in the original document, and I just extracted the first few sentences. But it's just a run-on, okay? And talking about all this stuff, provide data gathering, processing, management, and or analysis of internal, external data. And I just stopped and I said to the acquisition team, I said, what are you expecting? What is the result or outcome that you're looking for? And somebody piped up and said, well, we need them to create a data collection methodology. Whoa. You need them to create a data collection methodology. Where is that anywhere in this original statement? Well, that's just part of the gathering, processing, management. I said, that's not clear. If I'm industry, if I'm a vendor, I have no idea based on what you've written here that you're looking for a methodology. And I believe that there's a typo here because it says just there's an or here, and that's not correct. So the contractor shall create a data collection methodologies. I believe this is 4. I believe that we're missing an F there. That's what it is. We're missing an F. Let me change that real quick. I just can't stand that. We don't want the or, although you're going to see an or in the next paragraph, and we'll talk about that. All right, so the contractor shall create data collection methodologies for internal or external data. Oh, there's an or. Okay, now here's where this or is okay. The or is okay because some of the data might be internal, some of the data might be external. It's an or situation, okay? So sometimes the data is going to come from internal, sometimes it's going to come from external, but at the end of the day, the collection methodology is going to be the same. So said the agency, all right? The important thing is, what is the result or outcome? The result or outcome is the data collection methodology or methodologies, okay? So it's a set of methodologies. Okay, that's what we're going to get. That's what we're going to inspect. They're going to create it. It does not exist today. So they're going to create those methodologies, and then there's context for those methodologies, which I did not capture well here. So I'll have to revise this slide a little bit. But also coming from this paragraph is the contractor shall prepare, process, and manage internal and or external data using approved data collection and management methods. Well, guess what? They've created the methodology up here. Once it's approved, then they can use it to prepare, process, and manage internal or external data. Now, there's a list here: prepare, process, and manage. I don't love this. I don't love this list because there's a lot of things going on here. When it comes to inspecting whether they've accomplished the result or outcome, are we looking at the preparation part? Are we looking at the processing part? Are we looking at the management part? And for that matter, what does it mean to manage? So a couple things came out here when talking with this agency, and they said, well, they're always going to do all three of these things. I said, okay. So there will never be a time where they are only processing data, or they're only preparing it, or they're only managing it. They said, no, it's a whole system. They do all of these things all the time. So if you are doing multiple things, gathering, processing, managing, preparing, processing, managing, whatever that looks like, if you're doing all of those things and they always happen together, then it could be appropriate to put it together like this. But be mindful of what you're going to inspect. Okay, so what is the performance standard going to be for this requirement? And I'm not the expert. I'm not part of this agency, so I'm not entirely sure what they are going to inspect from a performance standard, what the quality standard is going to be, and the timeliness of it. So I think that this needs more work. But I will tell you this, at least moving from the original statement to these new statements, we now have additional layers of clarity. Each individual requirement is broken up separately, so we can see them clearly. And we can add additional context for these as necessary. And it allows us to have the conversation about what are we going to inspect. When we look at that original paragraph with all of its language, and I say, how are you going to know you got what you wanted, meeting the quality and timeliness that you expected? There's no way. It's too ambiguous. There's too many pieces. There's too much information, and we don't have a clear understanding of what the specific requirements are and how we're going to measure it. Now we can measure the methodologies and how well drafted those methodologies are. We can manage the preparation, processing, and management of internal and external data as it relates to using that approved data collection and process. So we're getting closer. All right, so when you're writing your requirements, use this ARC method. Focus first on your result, then on your action, and then on context to put it all together. All right, let's look at another example here. So this is the original statement. The contractor shall design and manage a test, training, and exercise to enhance the performance of stakeholders during a COOP event. All right, so first of all, design is clear. You're going to design something, but manage is a little less clear. And are they designing or are they managing? And which aspect of that are we going to evaluate? Furthermore, who are the stakeholders? Right? Who are the stakeholders for this event? What does manage mean? What types of exercises will be needed? How many people need to be trained? So now we're starting to get into some things where we want a little bit more specificity with our context. We want to be clear about the words that we're using in the statement itself. So this is where we start to take a statement and we put it against the question test. And this is something that will help you write better requirements. If you want to write better requirements, and you are I'm talking to you right now. If you are working in a program office and you want to write better requirements, have somebody that works in a completely different office come and review your requirements document with you, because they won't know what you're talking about. Because chances are you are working in a technical area in which you specialize, and therefore you understand what the requirements that you've written mean. That doesn't mean that everybody else does. So one of the things I love about our workshop model is that we bring in folks from the program office, the contracting office, subject matter experts from elsewhere in the agency. We bring in, sometimes we bring in the budget office, sometimes we bring in legal, but we bring together an actual team that is full of varied perspectives. And not only that, we oftentimes have observers coming from outside the agency that are typically there to observe our facilitation process, but also can help ask some of these critical questions. All right, so if you want to write better requirements, start asking questions about how you're writing them and what your terminology means. All right, so if we take this original statement, here are some of the questions that one might ask about it. Let's look at how we might revise these statements. In this case, we're going to revise these into a clearer ARC format. We're focused on the result and outcome, but we're also going to add additional context. All right. So first, the contractor shall draft a test, training, and exercise plan. Okay, now wait a minute. Back here, right? Shall design and manage test, training, and exercise. There's nothing about a plan here, but in fact, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a test, training, and exercise plan, right? Something that we can say, here are all the things we need to do. Here are the tasks involved. Here's our proposal, a timeline, our schedule. We want a plan so we can do this. Okay, so that's part of the design part. All right, so if we go over here, draft the plan. Who's it for? Now we're being a little more specific. So this is for emergency relocation group to use during a COOP event. Okay, so now we have more clarity on our stakeholder. A couple other things I want to point out. And you can see here on the left-hand side, this says C411. This is alluding to section C of the solicitation, subsection 4, subsection 1, first requirement. Okay, so you don't want to have just a section header in your PWS and then just a bunch of paragraphs or a bunch of statements or a bunch of bullets. Have unique identifiers for each requirement. So every time you have the contractor shall, you should have a unique identifier in front of it. This will help you matrix things, look at things later, create your performance requirements summary table, and it will help you have conversations with your vendors post-award when you have something you want to talk about, a particular requirement statement that you want to call out and say, hey, we're talking about requirements C411. Let's go there. Let's look at it. Okay, so use this this format for each of your requirements. Okay, now you can see there's additional context. This is how we do additional context. Okay, so the test, training, and exercise must include exercises on cyber malware threats to the government. Okay, so we're adding a constraint. All right, so we're saying you're going to draft this plan, but it has to include exercises on this particular topic. That's critical. All right, got it. Training modules must follow our e-learning style guide and include knowledge checks for each section. Okay, so we've got additional constraints, additional requirements for this draft plan. That's important. Here's some additional context. The agency is currently using Platcore on ServiceNow. That's going to help them understand technology constraint for them as they're developing this plan and what's going to go into the plan. So there's probably additional context yet that you could add to this, but I don't work at the agency where this was developed, so I don't know what those additional contextual elements might be. Now, if we look at the next requirement, the contractor shall execute the approved test, training, and exercise plan to prepare for ERG COOP events. We're going to provide some additional context here. So they're going to execute an approved plan. That's the key word there. They're going to execute the approved plan, and I forgot the word plan there, but they're going to execute it. Now, when you're talking about executing it, and you're executing a plan, that plan should include work breakdown structure, schedule, milestones, that sort of stuff. So they're executing against something that is executable, right? And so when we go to evaluate whether they are doing that, our performance standard is going to be something, as far as quality, is going to be something around how effectively they held to the plan, right? Did they meet their milestones? Did they adhere to the schedule? Limiting the number of changes required, that sort of thing. So our performance standard is going to vary depending on the needs of the agency and what's important to us. But it is something that we can evaluate the quality of, and we can also evaluate the progress in lieu of timeliness. So we're not going to say, you have to execute this by the 5th day of June. Instead, we might say, we're going to track progress of the execution. Are you, making steady progress towards the execution of this plan over a period of time? And we can do that with reference back to the plan, which again was approved. Now you can see there's some additional context for each of these. For planning purposes, as they're executing, hey, we've historically conducted 2 COOP events annually. That's important to know, gives perspective on, hey, if you're doing a COOP event every month, that might change the resourcing, the staffing that we need to have available to support you. How many personnel at the agency need to get trained? That's really important. So rather than say, hey, you need to give us 15 training classes. Okay, well, how'd you come up with 15 training classes? Well, we have so many personnel divided by how many people we think should be in a class, and that gives us 15. Don't do that. That's prescriptive. You're telling the vendor how to do the work. Instead, tell them you need the training, and here's how many people need to be trained. Let them figure out how many classes to offer, whether to offer them virtually, whether it's virtual instructor-led, if they're going to do some in-person classes, maybe for a subset of key stakeholders. Let them figure out how to do it. But you need to provide them critical information in terms of number of personnel that need to be trained. All right, Bill, you asked a good question. I'm going to come back around to plain language discussion here rather shortly, so hold on to that. Let me see if there's anything else that's popped up here in the Q&A. Must versus shall. Personally, I grew up on shall, so I still think that it's the most definitive that you can use. The FAR tends to agree with me, but in the FAR, must and shall share the same definition. So again, pick one and stick with it throughout. There's some I don't know what to call it, guidance coming out of plain language that says must is better. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's just me. So pick one and stick with it. All right, let's talk about ambiguity, and then we'll talk about plain language before we wrap up today, talking about some resources that will be handy for you. All right, so ambiguity. Let's read this first one. The contractor shall assist in supporting sprint demos to ensure the feature acceptance criteria were met at the conclusion of each sprint. First question, anytime I see the word assist or support or help or manage, the first question I ask the agency is, what do you mean by assist? What do you mean by support? What does manage mean? What does that entail? And they start telling me, oh, well, assist, that means that they're going to set up the meeting. Oh, so they're going to schedule the meeting? Yes. Okay, great. The contractor shall schedule sprint demos. There's your first requirement. Oh, okay. Well, what else is assistance? Well, they're going to assist in providing meeting minutes. Okay, the contractor shall document meeting minutes, or however you want to phrase it, but we've got another requirement. So yes, this does start to get more granular, but again, we're not telling them how to do the work. We're still just talking about the results and outcomes we're looking for. But when you say things like shall assist in supporting, you've created so much ambiguity there that you could have them do potentially anything, which is very frustrating to them. But it will also be frustrating to you because you won't have anything clear to measure. All right, so be precise with your language. The contractor shall schedule sprint demos. The contractor shall take meeting minutes for sprint demos. Whatever that looks like, be precise. All right, if you want them to actually conduct the meeting, if you want them to lead the sprint demo, then you could say that the contractor shall conduct a sprint demo. And we're going to provide some context. Who needs to be part of that? With the product owner, key stakeholders, and development team to ensure the feature, blah, blah, blah. All right, so who are key stakeholders? Hopefully those are identified somewhere in the contract language. If not, you really do need to define that. The development team is going to be defined in the contract because that's what the contractor is providing. And the product owner, this should be a government employee. So we're talking about the government product owner who's probably going to be the one doing the evaluation of this requirement to surveil that it has met our performance standards and expectations. All right, so the second statement here on this page, much clearer, much more specific. Could we use a better word than conduct? Possibly. But there's always room for improvement. But our goal is to be more precise and concise than we are being today. All right, let's see. Okay. So here's another example. And now we're starting to, coming back to that must shall thing. Get rid of this will and should business. Okay, get it out of there. No wills, no shoulds. Okay, if the contractor needs to do something, the contractor shall do something. If you need a report, must be provided by the 10th day of each month. And again, this second bullet here is really more of a performance standard. So this is what was in the original document that we looked at with the agency. You might say, well, this is really concise. Yeah, it is. And it's also not exactly clear on what we're trying to get. So let's dig in. So as we start asking those questions, again, we're asking those probing questions of the agency. What are the results and outcomes you're looking for? What is the objective? What are some of the details? Who are some of the stakeholders? What types of analysis are needed? Let's get clearer. Let's be more precise with our language. So that leads to two things. First of all, you can see at the top underneath this header, Family Life, External Studies, Audits, and Analysis, we have a descriptor statement. This is context that applies to all of the following requirements. This is a great practice. If you have a piece of context that you notice is applicable to multiple requirements, in fact, it's applicable to an entire section, move that context out from underneath the statement and put it up top. Put the context up there. This program is the skills-based relationship, blah, 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 blah. Assist commanders in building, strengthening family structure. Okay, got it. Now, here are the requirements. And again, we prefer not to use bullets. We'd like to see something like C.4.1.2 or whatever it is. So we want to see these not as bullets, but as actual alphanumeric identifiers. But here are our ARC statements. The contractor shall conduct and document. All right, so we've got two action verbs here. In this case, it kind of makes sense. We don't want them to just conduct a comprehensive review. We want them to conduct and document a comprehensive review of best practices in the field. Okay, got it. So what's going to happen? They're going to conduct the review. What are we going to inspect? Probably the documentation. The contractor shall develop surveys to gather input on program reform and future state. Okay, so what's the result? Surveys. What are they going to do about those surveys? They're going to develop them. Got it. So we will evaluate the surveys and the quality of them. The contractor shall deploy approved surveys to government-provided stakeholders. So, hey, get this. The government is going to provide the stakeholder list to which the surveys are going to be sent. But the contractor is going to be the one deploying them. And there's that key word again, approved. All right, so they're not just deploying any old survey. First, the survey has to be approved. Okay, so we build in those dependencies so that when the contractor submits their surveys to us and we're still evaluating them and they're trying to get ahead of the game and they go out and start issuing the surveys and we make a determination that we don't like this or that or the other thing in the survey, and they go, oh, too bad, we already started. You go, no, you're not following the contract. So you're actually violating this requirement by deploying an unapproved survey. So now we need to have a conversation about that. All right. So a lot of this stuff is nuanced, but at the end of the day, the most important thing is start with what is the result or outcome that you are looking for, then identify the appropriate action verb to put in front of it, and ensure that you have sufficient context to help industry understand the result and outcome in context. And for some of these, you may have additional bullets that fall under it. For example, how many surveys have you historically conducted on an annual basis? The agency has historically conducted 15 surveys annually to gather input on program reform. Okay, that's helpful. Now I understand I'm not just creating one survey. I'm not just creating, 3 or 4 surveys. It could be as many as 15, maybe even more. I don't know, but 15 is a good benchmark. I can price accordingly. All right, so most Anonymous says that our agency, most of the context like information on a program is placed in the background section. That's absolutely appropriate. So think of it this way. Starting at the top of your document with your background and then your scope, you know, the information that you provide up at the very top is applicable to the entire thing, right? And as you go down, there is some additional context that's probably only specific to a certain section. All right, so think about it that way. And then some context is specific to only a certain requirement or one or two requirements. So just think about it in terms of its applicability to the body of work. So if it's applicable to everything, go ahead and put it at that highest level in the background section. If it's only applicable to, say, family life, external studies, audits, and analysis, then just put it under that subsection. And then if it's only germane to a particular requirement, put it under that requirement. All right. Plain language. Plain language is key. On the right-hand side, you can see an example of a PWS in bare bones. Got a background section, scope of work, product vision. If you're doing agile IT development, put a product vision, and you can find information about that on the TechFAR hub. Then you have your objectives section. So we recommend writing high-level objectives for each of your task areas. If you want to learn more about that, come get a workshop for your requirement. Then you've got your performance requirements section, where you have them organized by high-level objective. They are all in the action result context format with additional context as needed. And then that, oops, my bad. That is followed by your performance requirements summary table. And that's where you're going to put your requirement, your standard, your AQL, incentives, etc. Use tables, use lists, use bullets, shorter sentences. Use technical language where it's appropriate to your requirement, but use plain common sense language to the maximum extent practicable. Stop using government jargon. It's not doing you any service. So one way that I always try and teach folks to think about it is write for a vendor you've never worked with before, right? Be as thoughtful as you can about the vendors that you haven't worked with before, and write your requirements accordingly. All right, just to hit home the point, we're going to finish in 2 minutes here. For every requirement, you should have a performance standard. Every requirement has a performance standard. That's critical. Do it. Don't neglect it. And finally, if you want help with this, if you would like help making this process, writing better requirements, having performance standards, thinking about this holistically, we've got a service for you. It's called our Civilian Service Acquisition Workshop. It's a free service, and it comes with CLPs for the acquisition team. Keyword there, acquisition team. So you need to pull together an acquisition team around a requirement, and we will come in and facilitate a workshop for that team to help you through the performance-based acquisition process from beginning to end. So every workshop, we will help your team develop a vision for your acquisition, mission for your acquisition. We'll help you develop your high-level objectives. We will go over this ARC methodology with your team and help everybody on the team understand it. And you will start writing your requirement statements in the workshop, as well as your performance standards. We also talk about market research and source selection innovations, and so much more in this workshop. It's really incredible, and it really helps teams to not only form and perform better, but also get some work done. Instead of the emails back and forth for months where nothing gets accomplished, we'll get your team focused and making progress. And of course, we're there to help you as a team build consensus. And when you have the contracting shop and the program shop together in the same spot, building consensus together is really valuable, because that will really help you solidify a clear vision of where you're headed and how you're going to get there. So check us out. If you want more information, go to gsa.gov/CSAW. And coming up in June, our next CSAW webinar is going to be on performance standards and the QUASP. You don't want to miss that one. It's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. I really hope that you've enjoyed the session today. It's been a pleasure. I'm so glad that you all were able to make it. That concludes writing better requirements using the ARC method. Thank you all so much. If you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. Otherwise, we'll see you again in the future. Thanks so much.
You're welcome to stay on for a little while and answer questions if you have time. So
absolutely.
So if people still want to stay on and ask questions, please use the Q&A just because it's easier for us to track and answer. But you're welcome to stay on and ask questions for a few minutes.
So somebody asked, some folks have a problem with when to use a statement of objectives. Lots of times they're listing outcomes in the statement of objectives. How are objectives different from outcomes? So if you are listing the contractor shall do X, Y, and Z, the contractor shall do X, Y, and Z. If you're listing specific task statements, you've moved beyond a statement of objectives. A statement of objectives does not get that prescriptive. A statement of objectives literally only says something like, one of our objectives is to stop the spread of COVID-19 in the United States. Boom. Well, how are we going to do that? I don't know. What's going to be involved in that? I don't know. That's why we are putting this out to industry for them to come back and say, here are our requirement statements. The contractor shall create a plan. The contractor shall set up testing stations. The contract. So they're going to list out all of the things that would be involved in trying to achieve that high level objective. So if you move beyond objective into specific results, the contractor shall statements, you've exceeded what a statement of objectives is intended for. What else we got? Anything? Okay, yeah. Oh, can I put the dates of the training back up? Sure can. June 20th, 1 p.m. Eastern is the next training on performance standards in the CWASP. August 15th is the CSAW webinar after that on source selection innovations. And that'll be our last webinar of 2024. I'm sorry, 2023. But we will have, oh my gosh, Trevor, are you kidding me? You're here today. My favorite acquisition innovation lab in the federal government is all of them, of course. But shout out to the lab at Department of Commerce because they are fantastic. And so if you're looking for some cool tips and tricks, check out the lab at Commerce. Good to see you, Trevor. Have I ever had any issues incorporating contractors' PWSs into a contract? If so, what? That's a tricky question, Tim. I like it, and I'm trying to think about how best to answer it. I think the trick is that when we receive performance work statements written by contractors, they tend to have high variability in terms of how they're written. And I would say one of the biggest deficits is that because we don't ask for it, they typically don't include performance standards. So they typically include a set of requirements, and they might have a handful of very broad, ambiguous, what they might call service level agreements, what I would just call ambiguous standards. So that's really the biggest challenge is if we're going to have industry respond to statements of objectives with a PWS, we need to provide them some structure, not necessarily overly prescriptive about what they need to put into it, but there are certain things we need. We need requirements. Each of those requirements needs to have a standard. So I think we can do better in our statements of objectives and how we ask for it. Keith, how can PWS be used for design build projects? Very specific question, but just as we've described, I understand that there are certain fields within government service fields where we have a lot of government specifications, guides, policies, regs that have to be adhered to. Some teams will say, hey, the contractor shall do X, Y, and Z in accordance with, and then identify a specific policy. So if what you're asking with respect to design build is how do we incorporate some of our prescriptive policy, regs, statutes, etc., related to design build, That's how we would typically do it. So we still try and follow the ARC format, but our context statements might actually end up making the requirement prescriptive. So bear that in mind. All right, folks. This has been really great conversation. Unfortunately, it is time to end the show today. I got to run to the next thing, but I'm so glad you all were able to be here. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care.